I'm supposed to moderate a distinguished panel now, and I would like to introduce the panel, or at least those members of the panel that you haven't met yet, but then I will ask them to shut up, which means that I want to give you a chance, you who have now been very carefully and very patiently listening to a number of different presentations. I would like you to have a chance to raise some of your questions first, and then we will draw on the expertise of the panel, which is substantial, to provide whatever further information and insight we can glean from that. You have already met Helmut Anheier, who is a member of the panel, and you've met Leon Botstein, and you've met Karin Beck. Those are the three that you know. Whom you don't know yet is Nicholas Eschenbruch, who sits over here on my left, who is a historian and social anthropologist, and who is the managing director of the University College Freiburg, about which you've now heard already from Karin, including its location in an old Jesuit college, which is a very pretty Jesuit college, but a very old one as well. So I think her point is very well taken about the difference of location and outlook. And right in front of me is Hannes Kloepper, who has also already been introduced by the ambassador, who is a graduate. He's really uniquely qualified to participate in this discussion because he's a graduate of both ECLA and of the Hertie School of Governance. So you can't have more pertinent experience on the topic that we are dealing with here. Hannes also is the co-author, together with the late Yehuda Elkanah, whom many of us know and loved, of a major new book on higher education, Die Universität des 21. Jahrhunderts, from which Phil Murphy has already quoted earlier. Hannes is now primarily occupied with a new initiative called iversity that is operating and very interestingly experimenting in the field of digitalized higher education and using the means of modern information technology in higher education. So these are the resources that we have at our disposal for the later part of our discussion, but we have agreed that after you've been so patient, we would now first hear from you, give you a chance to raise your questions and comments on what you've heard so far, and that later on the panel will get back at each other. Of course, I'm dying to get back at Leon on schools of education, but we'll put this off for a little bit until you've had a chance to raise your questions. So I keep standing up just so that I can see you better, and would invite your comments and questions at this point. Keep them short, and we will promise to keep the answers short. And we will collect a few questions first before I will call on some of my colleagues to respond to them as they see fit. And as you speak, or before you speak, or as you start speaking, please say who you are so that we get a little bit more acquainted with one another in the course of this discussion. The floor is open, ladies and gentlemen. Well, it's a good thing we have the panel to draw on, so, but I'm sure there is more curiosity in the audience than meets the eye. Yes, sir.
Yeah, this is, I'm Tom Miller from the U.S. Embassy. I was intrigued by Leon Botstein's comments about Harvard and the importance of the commons and socializing with people from other backgrounds. And I'm just wondering what your reaction is to the massive online courses and the emphasis on the cognitive and how that will educate the future citizen.
Could we collect a few questions, Leon, that may make the whole thing
if I
a
can
bit
remember
more
them.
I remind you, I keep track of it. Yes. Yes, sir.
A question really for the whole panel, I think.
Would you introduce yourself first?
My name is Matthew Raskoff. I'm a fellow of the Bertelsmann Stiftung. And it's a question, I think, for the whole panel, which is that what I heard, I think, is a justification of the liberal arts in fundamentally teleological terms that are justified by turning out citizens, by turning out people who will have certain skills. And it's a basically utilitarian argument for the liberal arts, which sounds to me self-defeating. I think it's contradictory, almost. And a true defense of the liberal arts cannot be a utilitarian one. I think it has to be more based on the thing itself. And I was curious about what the response would be from the panelists.
Very good. Thank you very much. Other questions? None? They are. Leon, why don't you take a first crack at it, and I invite everybody else to respond, including you, Leon, to the second question as well as the first. Go ahead.
So I might very brief to both. One is that the technology is, in my view, welcome, because the true act of teaching in small classes is not threatened by the technology, the human activity. So I make the, pardon the expression, that learning and teaching in its best sense are human activities in real time and real space, and all that's done by Udacity and by Coursera and all this is terrific. It puts bad teaching out of business. The big lecture hall in organic chemistry in the American State University is a waste of time and stupid, and there's no reason it should go on. So what we do in liberal arts college is only enhanced by the technology. We're not obsolete, we're actually going to be enhanced. So I make the analogy between technology and teaching and learning to technology and sex. Technology will enhance it, it won't create a surrogate. And we're happy about it. The people that are really concerned in the United States are the universities that have neglected undergraduate teaching, do it poorly, and essentially pay no attention to real instruction. Places where do real teaching should welcome the technology. Finally, the second question, I completely disagree with your concept of utility. I've never met anyone, including myself, who studied something for its own sake. This is some kind of nasty invention, Puritan invention, of learning for its own sake. I do learning because I enjoy it. Is enjoyment useful? It relieves me of boredom. Is the relief of boredom useful? It makes me a less savage person. The idea that there is some ideal, you're a bad boy and girl if you don't love it for its own sake. I've never loved anything for its own sake, only for its utility for my life. The distinction you make is fraudulent.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's ask Hannes Kloepper on the first of those questions. I'm sure you have something to say on that.
I do indeed. Does this work? Okay,
yes, it works.
It does work. Okay, great. I do indeed have something to say on this because I mean, your question was targeted as this, cognitive, the cognitive dimension of the fact that most of the courses that are out now are somewhat sort of geared towards telling people what the right answer is and making them, getting that information into their head. And I think that is certainly correct for a lot of the courses that are out there at the moment, but I think there are some caveats here, and I think this says very little about what's to come. Because, I mean, the people that have been doing this so far have all been doing this for the very first time. And oftentimes, they're far from experts when it comes to, theories of learning and the various experiences that have already been made in the field of distance education. So I think if we bring a lot of the insights that have been gathered elsewhere into the conversation of the MOOC phenomenon, then things might start to look very differently. And that will happen very soon because of the transparency and the fact that all this is very public. So I think the cycle of trying something out, seeing how it works, evaluating it, trying to make it better is going to run a lot faster than it did in traditional teaching, where someone may have gone on to do something that didn't work very well for 40 years without anyone ever noticing, because the evaluation at the end of the term, no one really looks at that, And then let me add one last remark on this. I think there is also quite a possibility, particularly for public higher education, that is, as Leon described, oftentimes, not what higher education should be, because yes, we do have the diversity of, people from 20 different countries in the Harvard classroom. but that's only in the Harvard classroom and maybe a few other colleges around the country. If you look at the average state university, you don't have the same kind of diversity. So having a conversation going on online where people from diverse backgrounds, not just different cultural backgrounds, but also age and experience join that conversation might be really truly enriching in the very best sense of what we consider worthwhile from perspective of the liberal arts education. And that may help to, that way technology may really help to improve education and make it go beyond the just sort of rote memorization that is often being criticized correctly today.
Thanks very much. I've thought of a better way of answering the question of the gentleman from the Bertelsmann Foundation than the one that Leon gave, and I can't think of one. I'd just add that one of the challenges really in thinking through the process that Leon was describing of getting to where liberal arts colleges are supposed to get, and I very much agree that we're on the way, that one of the tasks on that way is indeed to rethink the notion of utility. I think that's really where it's at, and not make a distinction between utility and non-utility. I do think, and I do agree, that there's a very interesting taxonomy of utilities that has important didactic and indeed philosophical implications. And I would love to think more about that, and I think people involved in liberal arts education ought to be thinking more about that. That makes for a more interesting agenda, I think, than the sort of dichotomous utility, non-utility one. Other questions now? I'm sorry, Karin, go ahead.
To add to that question as well. I just sort of made the same remark not so long ago in Canada at a conference to Richard Camber from Jersey State University, and he answered with something that convinced me, and that was society financing our colleges, or parents financing their children's education, have a right to ask the question, what is it good for? And we do have, as colleges that are financed by public money, most of us in Germany, we have a responsibility towards society to explain what it is good for. And I think it is not, so we saying it makes better citizens. I tried in my paper to say what it does do, it helps people to come into their own, to be the best they can be. If they later on actually are going to be the best they can be, that's the freedom they also take away from a liberal arts education. But I do think that we have to take the question of what is it good for seriously, even though I don't like it either. I really don't like it. And the other question in support of you and your argument, as it is hard doing actual, real, good liberal arts studies and really coming out, taking something out, is really hard work. And you only do that if you have a goal. It might not be your life goal, but you need to know why you do that. So I think, I was taught at Columbia, when I taught there, my mentor told me to tell the students, if you learn how to read, write, your life will be better. And I've always kept that as my main goal for them. But we do have a responsibility towards society as well.
The only thing on the technology question, for those of us, the technology has helped communicating with students and students with each other. So the technology has been a net plus. So the kind of thing that you're talking about is very good. And I was being facetious, but at the University of Virginia, there was a crisis. They tried to fire the chancellor. And I was invited by the faculty to give a talk on the purpose of the humanities and the so-called useless subjects. And I share Hans Weiler's view. I tried to argue that the definition of utility has to be changed, and that the humanists cannot walk around with a flag of non-utility as a virtue. So I put it a different way. One of the things facing our society is the decreasing need for work. There is no doubt that we face a fundamental transformation of how to define meaning in our life. That the work life that is available to us is diminishing in terms of the necessities of production. And the kind of work that is available to us is very hard to imagine how it totally will be to occupy the majority of our life. So given the construction of meaning and the creation of a sense of well-being, what we teach, which is the use of the imagination and the mind in the liberal arts, has a huge utility in people's sense of well-being. And it's immensely useful. And while you don't like the language, I don't find it, because we do have an ethical obligation to explain that this has a transformative capacity in the way people conduct their lives. And in a time when work may not be the only definition of one's role in society.
Yeah. Helmut Anheier?
I think I want to extend the argument a bit that Leon made in his presentation. He made the argument that university and community connect in the undergraduate education, but there is, at least in my opinion, a second premise or principle that is very important in the context of what we're talking about, and that is the connection between the parents and the university. And the undergraduate education in the United States has very much a theological and religious history that has then been driven out in the 20th century to some extent by the state universities as they came up, but also by the professoriate itself. So the old adage in locus parentis, that the professoriate takes on the role of the parent and then provides the connection to where the children come from, or the young adults come from, to the world of adulthood, that has been lost and has been put on a secular footing. And now we have a very secular professoriate, but in the United States at least, an increasingly religious society. And there's a serious disconnect there. And that then brings me to your point, the gentleman from Bertelsmann Foundation. You see, the utility argument, which I agree with the panel, is very misplaced. It could only take root because we have a very secular discourse, or a seemingly secular discourse at American universities, where then everything is seen in the context of economic utility of what you study. And I think this is what we run up against in the highly compartmentalized disciplinary structure of the undergraduate education as it is now. And the great premise I see in liberal arts education is exactly to go against the tide, right? So you do away with, you major in economics, you major in physics, you major in that, and you just fulfill your distribution requirements, and then you leave everything behind you. So going against this, going against the grain, and not making the argument, if you take this, if you major that, then you get into business school, right? That's why I wanted to make that point.
Okay, other questions? Herr Schnelle. We'll run for the microphone.
I'm Prof. Schnelle. I'm here from the Hertie Foundation, but I'm asking, as a teacher at the Free University, as a student or alumnus of the Free University and teaching American students at the Free University, and what I have been finding frustrating during the last few years with the American students, that they always, when we look back at how the course went, what comes most of the time that they wanted clear assessment, clear assignment, certain questions that I should give them when looking at a text, and then basically those questions being reflected in the midterms and in the finals. So very clear guidance and not being exposed to the challenge of looking at a broader spectrum of things to reflect upon. But they want so much more guidance, and I find too much guidance. And I wanted to ask you, as the practitioners, what is the trick to convince them that that is an essential part of university studies, to work your way through a maze of things that you don't understand right away how they are interconnected. So I would be very happy. And if I may add another question, has the tendency at Harvard for the most successful students going to Wall Street, has it changed recently?
Yeah, so very briefly, America has been overcome by a mania for testing and standardized testing. And since the financial crisis of 2007-8, there has been an enormous amount of fear of unemployment, underemployment, and just fear. The two have combined for a perfect storm that you describe of young people just wanting to know, how am I going to compete well? So how do I get a grade? What's the assignment? So this is something that, I know who the students you are, that you do have in an empathetic way to get them to walk away from. That asking questions, risk, inventing, this is something you have to teach. So I understand very well, and I'm sympathetic, because they have been traumatized by a nonsensical, high-stakes testing environment, and the process of getting into college is highly competitive and stupidly run, primarily by places like Harvard. So the problem is that places like Harvard are dominated by the professional schools, just as Penn is dominated by Wharton. So there is, unfortunately, not as much non-pre-professional atmosphere on the ground at some of our most selective institutions. So the dominant pressure is law school, medical school, business school. That is changing a little bit. First of all, that, but it's an uphill fight because there is, and I think certainly Wall Street has gone down. The real problem for us, for example, as medicine ceases to be economically as promising, we'll get better people going to medical school because they're going for a reason other than the economic and social status.
Yeah, addressing the same question. Is that technically okay? Yeah. All right. Okay. Yeah. I do think we have a bit of a similar situation in Germany too, with this very much increasing anxiety on wanting to know what's going to happen and being certain where one will be in 2 or 3 or 4 years. And at least that's a very interesting contradiction I also experienced with our first cohort of students, that on the one hand, they very consciously chose a choice-oriented program, and on the other hand, they want to know what's happening and what's going to result from that. And it's, from a teaching point of view, it's a bit challenging to say, not to give them answers and just say, look, that's the space you wanted to be in. It doesn't always feel comfortable. We can sort of indicate to you how to maneuver it, but it's the experience you chose. And in a way, that's one maybe advantage an interdisciplinary liberal arts program has over a disciplinary program that has other advantages.
Thanks. Let me just add my own 2 bits to that question. Clearly, going to Wall Street is also something that has to be differentiated a little bit. I just remind you that we had an ambassador here who started out at Wall Street and became a top-notch ambassador. So it's something to be kept in mind. But I also want to say that there is, as I perceive it, Leon, I don't know about you, a rather considerable concern on the part of many of the major universities to rethink this whole pre-professional area. Stanford has just completed a 2-year or 3-year study of its undergraduate program precisely with a view to how to marry, how to bring together the liberal arts tradition with the undoubtable pre-professional requirements and expectations that lay heavily on students. So there is quite a bit going on. If you're interested, on the Stanford website, you can find the report of that group. It makes for interesting reading for anybody who's interested in sort of the curricular momentum that's going on in some of the American universities. I now have 2 questions from Professor Lenzen and Professor Wilkins. Mr. Lenzen, do we have a microphone for him? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't have a question, but I would like to give a comment from the German point of view. I'm president of the University of Hamburg and vice president of the German Rectors Conference. I do really think that at the moment we have already a new change of discussion in Germany, and so far as at least a part of students have new questions, questions like yours, maybe 10% or something. And if we look to the history of the German university, then what liberal arts meant and mean was the notion of Bildung durch Wissenschaft, education by science or something. This idea was that students involved in research processes would educate themselves, not being educated, but educate themselves by doing research. So by putting themselves under the strength of method and all that. This was the idea of the German university in the Humboldtian kind. We have to differentiate this idea from the question if it really worked. That's another question. But this idea lasted for 2 centuries. And during the last 10 to 15 years, we had the change that you complained also, maybe something like a McDonaldization of the German universities in the Bologna process. The Bologna process made that very easy to change into the direction of only utility questions. And the question now for the German system is, we are in this process, we cannot avoid it, we cannot get back to the continental system of universities as we used to have them 2 decades ago. The question is, should we now also do the second step and also take over what, for instance, in the United States, liberal arts meant and mean? There are 4 kinds of doing that. What we discuss in our circles at the moment. The one are colleges, of course, for liberal arts. That's very difficult to convince politicians to pay for that. The second idea is to have courses in different kinds within another system of courses. And the best way, of course, would be to have professors who are able to discuss their special things under the question of how to be a human being. So our professors, more or less, are very specialized in their questions. I give you an example which is very characteristic. Some students came to me some weeks ago and said, can you do something against our professor because he teaches us to calculate from which age on it doesn't make any economic sense to give health to an old woman. So he has a formula with 15 variables and so on, and we don't want to discuss these questions. So we can see there is a change in the mentality of some of the students at least, but we now need to have a new place for these discussions because Bologna doesn't allow that.
Thanks very much. I have one other question. Let's add that and then see what our panelists will have to say. Frau Dr. Wilkens here.
Okay, thank you. My name is Uta Wilkens. I'm the Vice Rector for Teaching at Ruhr University Bochum, and probably I deal with a similar question you just mentioned, Professor Lenzen, because I am in the responsibility for further development of the study systems, and in Germany, or especially at the Ruhr University, and for our university that means more than 20,000 undergraduate students in more than 60 undergraduate programs. And we want to go into the direction of B. We do not have the opportunity to go into the direction or to take the alternative A, but we can integrate some curricular elements in all study programs, and we are very convinced to go into this direction. Probably we do not have C professors, or many of them, but we have nearly all professors who deal with the fundamental questions of their disciplines, and they are connected with each other. Certain disciplines are connected with questions of life cycles and death. That's biology, but that's also economics. That is the engineering faculty as well. So all of them can contribute and can connect each other in these fundamental questions. And we have certain examples of that. And I think that is also a way of how to convince faculty and probably you do not need to convince students. Not everybody will take that opportunity, but we have to integrate this opportunity. But then we have to come to a further question of implementation all over a campus. And now you made the point that we probably need professional schools, and I think they are not necessarily a driving force. I do not regard them as an obstacle, but not necessarily as a driving force, because I think it is more the idea and the faculty that is convinced, that realizes that it can contribute to that, but not another institutional form as well. So, or do you think we need a further kind of institutional organization that makes it more, or to improve the realization of that process? That is my question.
Before I call on my colleagues, let me just take up the last question that you asked me specifically, and then I'll open this up. I do indeed believe that thinking about professional schools, even if you do not attach all that much significance to the concept as such, but thinking about professional schools as an alternate way of organizing universities is an interesting intellectual exercise that is bound to bring about some change in the traditional makeup of German universities. That is, in a sense, it's a heuristic purpose that I'm pursuing here by positing a model that by its own makeup is bound to cast questions about the logic of the traditional organization of German universities. I think there's something terribly unimaginative about the way German universities are organized. They're essentially organized along disciplinary lines, which is clearly one way of doing it, but certainly not the only way. There are different ways of organizing knowledge, and what I'm arguing for is to think about structures that reflect this diversity of thinking about knowledge. And professional schools is one vehicle, one way of making a different, creating a different kind of logic for both the production and the dissemination of knowledge. That's my main concern here. There are certainly other ways of doing it, and there are certainly other ways in which one can think about further differentiating and further diversifying the internal structure of German universities. But professional schools strike me as being one, and I've found that at least in discussions at German universities, it serves precisely this purpose. Not that they all run and establish professional schools, but they do start thinking about the adequacy of the existing structures. And that's already a step in the right direction, as far as I'm concerned. Let me throw this open and see whether my colleagues have some other questions, some other answers on the questions that Professor Lenzen and Professor Wilkins has raised, particularly about the sort of calibration of strategies, whether it makes sense to think of sort of ABC as different ways of moving in the direction of the liberal arts ideal. Leon?
So we have a parallel tradition of learning by doing, which is from Dewey, particularly in the sciences. So the reform, it's different, I understand, but the difference, for example, if you look at the integrated science program at Princeton, which takes all the disciplines, computer science, physics, biology, and gets problematic and gets the first-year student into the laboratory working on scientific questions, as opposed to the sequence of scientific training so that the chemist finally gets to the bench 4 years after he or she started the study. So this tradition is integratable with the liberal arts, and it's an interdisciplinary, very high-quality, new approach to science education in the first years. I would recommend that one structure which has worked best in the United States is the formulation of common courses, where faculty get together. The best examples are Chicago and Columbia. And they really have done very well, where the faculty negotiate on the question of the patient and euthanasia. So you have everything from Montaigne to Plato to scientific questions, engineering, and they bargain on a curriculum. And then they teach it, and the students from varying disciplines take these courses, and it creates a common conversation. So the argument of structure is resolved by a debate about creating a common, and then it breaks up the issue of what do I have to do, because suddenly the teaching is not by authority, but by the quality of reasoning. I teach in such a course. So when I teach the Republic of Plato, or I teach Also sprach Zarathustra, I am not a philosopher. I'm an intelligent reader. Now I've prepared this, but I'm able to guide the student, and I'm dealing with the circumstance in which there is not a right answer, necessarily, interpretively. There are qualities of responses. And this is a curriculum that's negotiated by people from a variety of fields, and a variety of fields teach it. This has been extremely successful in Chicago and in Columbia. And that's why the worst offender in the American university system, in my judgment, is Brown. Because it has nothing like this at all. It's completely irresponsible on this question of general education.
Hannes?
Yeah, actually, there are a number of points that connect to this, and one obviously being that this very type of course I've taken at ECLA, because the courses are regularly taught, team taught by faculty from different disciplines. And I think that is indeed an interesting model, and I would also like to respond to this idea that, well, how can we do this in the universities? In public universities, I mean, obviously there's a matter of, how many faculty can you afford to teach a single course, and you can, at a state institution, probably not have 4 faculty teach a course together, and that is appreciated, but still, I mean, having a conversation doesn't necessarily cost anything.
Technology helps there.
I would get to that, but at the outset, and the thing that always strikes me as curious when it says sort of this Bologna reform was sort of dropped in front of us, and then we had to deal with it, and there was little we could do. I don't quite understand, because I mean, there is this notion of employability that's always stressed, and yeah, well, we had to comply with this requirement of employability, but I find it odd that university professors whose job it is to teach critical thinking did not dare to reinterpret that term. I mean, what does employability mean in the 21st century? One could have just argued, well, employability is just what we've been discussing here tonight. And then acted accordingly and designed programs that teach toward that objective. I mean, no one ever said that employability means 6 semesters of disciplinary education and don't look left or right. And I mean, there is this Ergänzungsbereich, which Leuphana creatively is using creatively to provide a full semester. I mean, if you add it all up, throughout, well, okay, the first semester, but like alongside there's another, throughout the 5 semesters, the fall, the first semester, to provide students with a comprehensive general education at a state institution. So, I mean, it's not impossible to do that if you think about, okay, how do we make use of this time, and if you have faculty that are willing to get together and come up with and agree upon a curriculum that is more than the sum of its parts.
Let me just add another example to what one can do and how this calibration issue can be handled. We've had a very successful experience at Stanford, which was initiated by Gerhard Casper, who's a good friend of Leon's, and myself, who's a lawyer who came out of Germany and became president at Stanford. And he's introduced a system of seminars for first-year and second-year undergraduates that are taught to a maximum of 8 students per seminar by some of the most research-intensive faculty members of the university. And they're teaching about their research. The seminars are about the research that they are doing. We offer by now, I think, about 143 of those seminars per year. And they are so popular, not only among the students, they are popular among the students, but they're so popular among the faculty that the faculty agreed to do those on top of their regular teaching load because they are such exciting and interesting and interactive kinds of educational experiences. So, and those are, first and second year students in America are even younger than beginning students in Germany. Nobody has ever even seriously raised the question of whether they're capable of following those kinds of seminars. They're doing a terrific job following those seminars because there is a way of dealing with this in the eyes of and with the view of the professor who involves the students in his or her research experience and project. I just wanted to add that. Let me ask. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but we agreed that that was a possible contribution. Is Catherine Toll here? Catherine is a dean at ECLA, and I could imagine that you are facing some of those questions that were just raised. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, actually, I'd like to ask.
Can we have a microphone there?
Specifically, a question to Nicolas Eschenbruch, and it alludes back to the theme you opened with, Professor Anheier, about these ethics courses that, in a sense, were kind of pasted on to existing programs, or if that would be some kind of solution in a way to what I understand to be the question of thinking about the purposes and the values of particular courses of study, particular disciplines, even particular modes of professional training. And obviously ECLA's program, as has already been mentioned, is designed to put those sorts of issues in the forefront. But one thing that we're always confronting and reconsidering, especially as we think about ways to develop the program further, is this issue of how that actually affects the existing conception, not only of teaching structures, but of disciplines themselves and the formats in which they're taught. I know your program at Freiburg is relatively new, and it's probably, this question, the answer to this question is probably going to be developing over time, but I just wondered if you already had thoughts about ways in which the teaching of liberal arts, and Karin Beck described your institution as combining the German tradition with the American and so on, ways in which that's going to affect the existing conceptualization of disciplines within these larger university structures, and what sort of dialogues you see opening up there, or what kinds of even structural changes might be possible, especially going back to this, the mention of programs in the United States that have a very long tradition of success in kind of common conversations between faculty about how this might be done, and the kinds of compromises people have to be prepared to make, and the work they have to be prepared to do to transform the way they teach and the material they teach. Do you already see an effect from what you're doing on the larger university structure to which you're connected? Okay,
you want to take a quick crack at that?
I think
we are running out of time.
It's a very interesting question. So far we have 78 first semester students towards a total of 24,000. So I think we're not such a powerful change agent yet. But still the question is very relevant, because one thing we're supposed to do as a college institution is to provide a forum or a laboratory for trying out ideas in instructional design and in teaching. So the idea is very much that teaching personnel from all the faculties, if they want to try a new format, if they want to teach something that they can't teach in their faculty, can approach us, or we can approach them, and provide a stage, so to say, where they can develop their things, experiment, and then take it back to their faculties. And this is not just a one-way thing, because in the individual faculties, lots of interesting ideas exist. So again, the idea is to, maybe spotlight people and say, look, if somebody's doing something in medicine, they got a prize for it, for, modeling the brain and actually playing with structures. Why can't they do that here and then take it somewhere else? So that is an explicit mission we have as to be a change agent in instructional design. That is definitely one thing we do. For concerning the structure of the disciplines, I think disciplines are very resilient creatures. And, in the context of a very big research university, that's legitimately so. And time will tell what the transfer both ways can be, because also we might have to readjust and say we need some more disciplinary input in 2 or 3 years' time. I can't tell that yet. But the question is definitely very relevant, how a small college institution can be a change agent. And that links back to the points that Professor Lenzen mentioned, which structure do you choose, and is it appropriate to be a change agent in the relative setting?
Well, we are getting close to the time that we've set for letting you go and enjoy the rest of the evening. Oh yeah, I will. Don't worry. I just want to do what in a London pub is the last call. This is your last chance to raise a question, and then I will ask my colleagues on the panel to see whether they have a last word, and that includes me. But first, it's your turn, and see whether there are any more questions that we could deal with. That does not seem to be. I'm sorry.
This is working. Okay. Hi, I'm Aya, and I'm currently a second-year BA student at ECLA. So these are all my teachers, and I'm very happy to be here talking with them today. I have a rather simple question, and this is something that, as a student of ECLA, I'm always thinking about. I'm always sort of struggling with. Is how do you bring the liberal arts outside of the classroom and into civil society? How do you take something like the Republic of Plato and translate it into something that actually affects society well? I mean, it seems very simple, but with the range of disciplines that we're doing, it seems at times that there's so much to choose from, but also it boils down to nothing really concrete. So I'm wondering, I'm happy to hear anything that any of the panelists want to say about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And let me just include that question in my last call for the members of the panel, and let me ask my colleagues here to answer your question if they feel like, or if they know how to answer it, but also to add whatever final and brief last remark on the topic of today they would like to make. I'll start with Karin. Would you
Sure,
take a
thank you.
crack at it?
Yeah, you said that's a simple question. I don't think it is. And I would like to do the really mean thing that I learned to do as a teacher. Well, that's your job. I push that back to the student. You as the student are the person who will go out being informed by the Republic of Plato, and you will apply it or not, that's your decision, in your life out in the society. That's not a lot. I know, because you have encountered the Republic, you think this is really cool, and I think this is really cool, and it would be so great if more people would just know about it, and we could actually apply it in society building. But I don't think university that's the job of university. It's not the job of universities to directly influence society building and the society development. I actually think that's part of the problem we see in society nowadays, that we rely more and more on experts for political decisions. The worst case of that is all these economy experts who keep on telling us how the economy is going to develop, who go beyond what science can say because science is analytical, make predictions for the future, and thus influence politics directly. And thus I think it's not a very satisfying solution, but I would actually say bringing it outside of the college is your job, and mine as well, because I'm not or the job of any professor or teacher or administrator, because we're not just professors and teachers and administrators. We are also citizens. We are mothers, we are fathers, we are brothers and sisters, and we live out in that world, and our life out there is influenced by what we teach. I think you have a way to go to that until you're there, but I haven't learned as much in college as I did since I finished and I graduated and I got the degrees and I started teaching. That's when you really learn a lot. And that's what I would like to put as my final remarks to this. I would really give the modern students a break. My colleagues know that I always do that. I don't think it's right that the students nowadays are less critical than we used to be in the bad old days, or the good old days. I think our professors said about us that we are uncritical in the same way we say about this generation that they are uncritical. You can find it already in Aristophanes, the clouds, the students complaining about the professors complaining about the students. It's just part of the discourse of the university. But we can't expect them to come in and be those critical thinkers and have all those competencies, to have that broadened mind that we say a liberal arts education gives them. Then it would not be necessary. So I think it's not only that for the students it's hard work. For us, it's hard work as well to keep back, to let them develop, but to really give them the space and to over and over again push the student beyond that limit of where they feel comfortable. It's very frustrating. I mean, who doesn't want guidance? You know, you don't want to be out there without guidance, you know, taught in the core. You know, Dante, you know, doesn't want to be out there in the Inferno without Virgil. And so you have to push them. And it's hard. It's hard for you and it's hard for them. But I think that's the job of liberal arts education.
Thanks very much. Leon?
Yeah, in answer to your question, I think that it gives you the equipment to ask when you get into a political debate how it is that the other person thinks about the political claims they make in relationship to their view of the nature of truth. So at the core of your reading of the Republic is some understanding of the connection with the theory of epistemology and a political society. And since much of the Republic raises questions about commonly held language assumptions about what the right thing to do is or what the nature of you living in a community, and you enter a political debate, the close reading of the Republic and having had to write about it puts you in a position to be more empathetic and more aware of what the questions are being raised even by people who don't have the education you have. It provides you some capacity to think about the resolution of questions with the equipment from the tradition of discourse that is about the right way to order a society, for example. It also gives you an acute ear for the use of language and how people argue. So I think you have to apply it, but the equipment you bring to the conduct of your daily life is through the analytical and expressive sophistication of your perception, which allows you to see beyond yourself. And so I think it's immensely useful, useful not in that sense, helpful. I do think that I have no nostalgia for the past, none, and for past students. I do think what we're engaged in is also something that's related to this discussion, and that is the preservation of traditions of learning and of memory, because the accessibility of surface is extremely seductive. So developing curiosity is much harder, but the students are much more quick. So it is the reform of the university and the disciplines is also partly, I'm a real believer that we are in the conservation business. We're in the anti-fashion business. We're in the anti-common sense business. We're in the issue of counterintuitive claims. Most people still think the earth is flat, and they cannot explain to their children that it isn't. So they only rely on authority. They cannot tell a child, an educated human being, why it is that the earth is not flat. That's a problem.
Thank you. Hannes?
All right. Yeah, I mean, let me start this answer with a little anecdote, and that comes from a paper that Klaus Offe, who is my professor here at the Hertie School, wrote on the question of whether Western universities have a mission. And he tells that little anecdote in this paper where he says when he was at Stanford University, they had this map, a campus map, because Stanford campus is huge, the second largest campus, university campus in the world. and there's a dot in the middle that says "you are here," and someone was clever enough to sort of etch into it and says, "Yes, but why?" You know, and I think that what your liberal arts education will help you do is answer that question, and help you answer questions such as, "How do I come to want what I want?" And I mean, during my time at ECLA, for example, I came to the conclusion that what I wanted to do is work in education, partly influenced by reading The Republic, which is now what pays my bills. So, you know, it did end up getting me somewhere that is useful as well as, you know, fulfilling and all these other various things that we've been discussing. So I think there is an objective, but it may not be clear at the outset, but connecting the dots in hindsight, it'll all make sense. So I'll give you that for your way. And what it is that I'm currently working on, I think, is indeed also relevant to this larger conversation. And that's one note on technology, and then I'll leave it at that I wanted to make that, when I said I'll come to that. If we look at some of the courses that have been submitted to the MOOC fellowship contest that we at Iversity are running in collaboration with the Stifterverband, they are exactly this. For example, a course on health that looks at health from an economic, sociological perspective, a medical perspective, and the perspective of nursery. These kind of courses that bring people together also from different places to teach together online, that should then be contextualized and discussed on the ground, I think could go a long way towards bringing this kind of multidisciplinary approach towards large mass universities that may otherwise have difficulties implementing this in practice.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Nicholas.
Yes, two brief remarks. The one general remark may sound terribly confrontational, but it really isn't. One thing I wanted to mention in this context of higher education decision makers is that I think a liberal arts experience is not an Erweiterungsbereich, because I keep hearing that. And Freiburg BAs also have an Erweiterungsbereich, and it's very useful, but it's quite different. And I think an Erweiterungsbereich potentially maybe can be a liberal arts experience, but only if the whole institution or a clearly delineated part of the institution identifies with that mission. So that's, I think, even though our programs may be quite different, one thing we would probably agree on. In respect to your question, I'll come back to the utility question as well, because in one sense, I think what the Bologna process has not been very good at, or even discouraged, is creating places for non-utility. I think those places should be created from, let me phrase that differently, for non-utility from a disciplinary point of view, where students can pursue their own utilities. And I think that's something that maybe needs to be paid attention in reworking this whole process and working through it. And it's something we try to do in our Studien- und Prüfungsordnung. The soul of a German degree program is its Studien- und Prüfungsordnung, unfortunately. And so we have a space where students can apply to do a project. If they want to teach Plato's Republic to disadvantaged children, they can apply to do that. If it's of academic relevance, they have to convince the Board of Studies. And I hope we'll have submissions for that soon.
Thanks. Helmut?
Well, also two comments. The first one has to do with, it's a bit of a hobby horse of mine, but I think in the context of the VA and Bologna, the disciplines are a bit like the nation state. They are sometimes useful, but sometimes really in the way of a more problem-oriented education. Then within our curriculum, to your question, my dear colleague, in the curriculum is always a very competitive thing, isn't it? You can only do so much. And it's my experience here at the school, but also at other public policy schools where I work and taught, that issues of ethics, and that includes citizenship, and that includes so many topics of interest to us tonight, are easily crowded out by be it quantitative analysis or by being other things in the curriculum. And you simply have to acknowledge that and now think about how can we react to it. And I think we need to react to it by making space for it in the curriculum that is somewhat protected right? That is more difficult to crowd out. And I think there should be a course here at a Hertie school that would be compulsory for everybody, but that would be, we wouldn't teach ethics as the way it may be conventionally taught, but a series of very intelligent and in-depth case studies around dilemmas of policymaking. And keep in mind, some of the most fascinating and case studies we have on normative foundations of policymaking come out of an interdisciplinary background. Just give you two. One is the Richard Titmuss on the gift relationship and why we have particular transaction modes in society constructed around a dilemma. Or think about Calabresi and Bobbitt, the tragic choice model. Right? So as a policymaker, you always come across a tragic choice. Whatever you decide is wrong. There's no right answer. Or is there? Right? And then you can create stories around that and sensitize the students. So that's a bit of the curriculum reform that we have in mind here for the school in the next years.
Thank you all. I did want to have the last word, but it ends up that I will. First of all, let me respond to Leon's point about schools of education. I very much agree with you. There are lots of crummy schools of education. There are also quite a few crummy liberal arts colleges, I think. That is a matter of some further research, maybe. But it's absolutely true. But there are some significant exceptions, and my best answer to your point about schools of education is to invite you to come to Stanford and look at a school of education that does what it's supposed to do. And there are quite a few of those. And some of the things that are developing in Germany make me very hopeful that they're on the right way to coming up with a slightly different but very interesting model. Particularly, your point was well taken that the strength of German teacher education, which has lots of weaknesses, but the strength of German teacher education as compared to American is much more of an emphasis on the substantive knowledge of subject matter and of disciplines. Clearly, German teacher education, for secondary education particularly, has an edge over American education there. But let me add 2 points just briefly by way of a concluding remark. Obviously, I was quite favorably inclined towards the notion of liberal education, liberal arts education, when we designed this conversation, and we had, those of you who were part of it, we had similar conversations already during the last 2 roundtables that we've had with the ambassador. So there is a bit of a gestation here, and I'm delighted to see not only that there are more and more interesting ideas coming up around the issue of liberal arts education, but also that a process of thinking about this has come into motion, very much along the same lines as I mentioned earlier about the professional school. It's not necessarily in order to sort of emulate and imitate something that exists elsewhere, but to get a process of thinking in motion that questions some of the practices and some of the assumptions that underlie undergraduate education in this country. And I think there is a great deficit of that kind of thinking in the context of the Bologna process. The Bologna process has been very much concerned with structure, with regulations and rules, and very little with content. And I think there is a process that can be influenced and can be fertilized by the kind of discourse that liberal arts education has generated. So I'm very hopeful, and I'm very confident and very encouraged by the fact that there is a critical mass of interest in this room, around this country, of people who are interested and who are willing to engage in this process of thinking. And I wish it well, and I will follow it with a great deal of interest and a great deal of attention. I'm not a great fan of alliteration, but I couldn't help jotting down 3 sort of key concepts that kept coming back as we were talking about what is so special about liberal arts education. And the way it comes out is that it does cover 3 C's. What I think liberal arts education is very much about, and what this conversation has again confirmed that it is about being curious, about being critical, and about being creative. That may not be an exhaustive definition of what it is, but I think it points in the direction in which we ought to continue thinking about it. With that, I thank all of the people who have been involved in today's exercise, today's discussion. I would like to thank Frau Kreitz, the officer in charge of public affairs, for putting up this wonderful organization. And I would like to thank once again Martina Kohl from the embassy, who has been a wonderful partner in this. Thanks to you all. Keep at it and have a good evening. Thank you.